So I'm with Richard Woods, a catamaran designer and sailor, and we're talking about various features about catamarans. And right now we're going to talk about galley up versus galley down. It's a kind of a strange phrase. So Richard, if you want to just sort of explain what we're talking about with galley up versus galley down.
Yeah, it does sound strange, doesn't it? The galley down means having the galley in one of the hulls, and the galley up means having it on the bridge deck. And these days, so many catamarans are built for the charter trade, and they tend to be larger, over 40 feet. And that's when a galley up on the bridge deck makes quite a lot of sense for, and then the smaller boats having them in the hull makes sense. And on offshore boats that are sailed regularly, where you're going to be day after day cooking at sea, having the security of somewhere to wedge yourself against and lean back on one side and still be able to cook is when you having it in the hulls is good.
Yeah, we had galley down, and for sure at sea, I liked knowing that any hot pots, especially when Maya was little, having the hot pots all sort of in a secure area so I could keep her out of the galley easily. Just sort of those parenting things. But also going through rough weather, it was nice to know that it was all sort of in a contained space. But I can see the galley up. We had a lot of friends who have bigger catamarans and they had galleys up. And those were awfully fun for parties and that kind of thing. So I guess, does this come down to a personal taste thing, or are there elements that we should really be looking at when we're looking at galley up versus galley down?
Well, as I've just said, anything under about 40 feet and a galley up doesn't work too well because you've got a limited space. And when you've got a galley up, you've got to have a passageway through across the boat so you can get past the cook and you can get down into the hull. So you end up with a lot of floor space, which when people aren't actually walking on is a waste of space. And that's one factor. I've sailed on a number of boats with a galley up, and to be honest, our scooter Power Cat had a galley up in the saloon, but that was all the accommodation. The accommodation was a 12-foot by 10-foot box that we lived in. So we had everything there. We had the shower and heads compartment and the saloon and the double bed and the galley. So I have done a lot of living on board with a galley up. And when I did the Cape Town to Rio race, which was on a Norseman 43, that had a galley up. And it was, and the Leopard 39 I sailed to the Bahamas last year, that had a galley up. But those two boats, apart from, even though they were sort of the 40-foot or above mark, they had very, very limited saloon seating area, for example. And particularly on the Leopard, you could sleep, what was it, 2, 4, 6, 8 people. But inside, you could sit 2 people and neither of them comfortably. And one of the things with a cruising boat is that, as opposed to a charter boat, is that you spend most of your time at anchor. And with a charter boat, you're going to be going day sail from one harbour to the next, one anchorage to the next. And then you come in and you stop. And to be honest, usually you eat ashore if you can. So you cook breakfast, coffee in the morning, and you might have lunch or lunch at sea, which might be sandwiches. So you do very much less cooking than when you are living on board. And the other thing is that you tend, as you just said, that when you're chartering, you tend to have a sort of a party atmosphere every night because you're with your friends or family for just a couple of weeks, which again is not something that you do when you're living on board. And one of the things that I always want is, can the can you sit up, put your feet up and read a book or watch TV, watch a movie on your laptop screen? And on that Leopard 39, you couldn't do that at all. There was, and that was because they had a galley up. And
So,
then, so that's
okay.
then the other problem is if you've got the galley up instead of in the hull, what do you put in the hull instead? And again, normally on the charter boats, you're going to have shower, at least one shower compartment, if not two in each hull. And then that very nicely makes the four corners of the boats four separate bedrooms with ensuite. But when you've got the galley up and you're living on board, a lot of the livable boats just have basically a passageway from the front to the back, and it seems such a waste of space. Like the early privileges were like that, for example, and you went down into a railway corridor and went forwards or back, and it was just seemed so pointless, really, when it was ideal for a galley down. So
Right.
people, you've got to really think what you want to do with a boat, and just because there's 1,000 Lagoon 38s being built, remember that 980 of them were built for chartering.
Right. Well, and that's, I think that it's hard when you're looking at a boat to really get a sense of how you're going to use it, but you almost need to visualize, if you're a family, having the kids run around while you're trying to cook in a galley up, and visualizing how homeschooling is going to occur at that same time when you're trying to make food. Or, you know, in our boat, it was usually something would be disassembled on the table at the same time. Evan had a workshop space down in one of the hulls, but somehow that, even though he had his workshop space down in a hull and Maya had a desk down in a hull, those things kind of come up to the cabin because that's where the view is and that's where kind of the action is. And to throw a galley up there too, I think would have been a lot of chaos on our boat, but I don't know,
And
other
that was
people
only,
managed to make it work. Sorry,
and
say
that
that.
was, yeah, well, the other reason why galleys traditionally were down in the hulls is because you used to, on ocean passages, you would navigate with a morning sight, a noon sight, and an evening sight, which is exactly the same time as when you're going to eat. So you want to keep the those procedures separate. But even now, even though you've got a chart plotter and so on, you're quite likely to be getting charts out and seeing where you're going the next day, and talking about it. And again, on the smaller boat, you when you haven't got that much galley space, you use the saloon table as a worktop.
Right,
Um,
that's for
and
sure. Yeah.
And that's another, you mentioned about the young children. Fortunately, I've never been in that position. But having all the dangerous heat and flame and whatever down in the hull, well away from everyone else who might be partying, is always seems to be a good idea. And I guess it also depends on the sort of cooking that you actually like doing. Are you too embarrassed to see people, watch people, watch you cooking? Do you want to suddenly appear with your souffle and your raspberry pavlova and say, here it is? Or do you want to see them cooking it? And that's another thing that you can decide. See, where in our house here, our living room, dining room is separate from the kitchen. So I don't know, and that some people live in the kitchen area,
That's true.
and so it's another thing that's a lifestyle, as you said. What is it that people like to do? Some people really do want to socialize at all times, but regardless of any of that, you end up with a smaller saloon with a galley up, and big empty passageways. So the first thing to do really is say, this is the saloon size I want. I need to have 4 people sitting round, able to have their own corner, basically like their own armchair to sit in, and watch TV together, or that sort of thing, like you would at home. And then say, can the galley still fit in that space? And
Right.
if it can't, then put it in the house.
That's a great way to wrap this up then, and just sort of when people are looking at boats, really don't just look at them, but sort of probably model how you're going to live in it a little bit to make sure you can make that layout work for yourself. And that's great. All right. Well, thank you, Richard. This was been really interesting discussion on galleys.